My name is Ranger Eli Warren. I've spent the better part of 9 years working for the Alaska Department of Natural Resources, mostly patrolling remote stretches of public land that see more moose than people. When I tell people I live alone most of the year, they picture some romantic solitude, mountains, silence, self-reliance. They don't picture the rot, the damp, the endless dark that makes you forget what your own voice sounds like. 2 months ago, I got a certified letter from a law office in Fairbanks. My uncle, Henry Warren, had passed away at 72. I hadn't spoken to him since I was a teenager. The letter said he'd left me his cabin, and that I was to take personal possession within 90 days. No one else in the family wanted it, half because of distance, half because of Henry's reputation. He'd been a ranger, too, back in the 70s. Left the service abruptly, no official explanation. Lived up north ever since. I drove up yesterday after my shift ended, loaded down with supplies from the station. Canned food, a chainsaw, diesel jugs. The cabin sat about 30 miles from the nearest maintained road. A half-day's drive on gravel followed by another 2 hours on a logging trail only the locals used. I had an old department truck with snow chains and a shotgun on the rack. In Alaska, that's not paranoia, it's insurance. The place appeared out of the fog like it was waiting for me. Dark timber walls, metal roof dulled with rust, smoke pipe leaning to one side. There were no lights in the windows, no sign of anyone for miles. The property line ran to the base of the ridge, where the forest thinned out into tundra scrub. A single frozen creek cut across the yard, the kind that sings faintly under ice. I unlocked the door with the key taped to the deed envelope. The hinges groaned. Inside smelled of old pine and diesel. It looked like my uncle had just stepped out and never come back. Boots by the door. Mug half stained on the counter. A cot still indented from a body long gone. But what caught my attention wasn't any of that. It was the paper tacked beside the window. It was a handwritten list, folded once and nailed to the frame. At the top, in block letters, was RLSFROCCUPNCY. Below that, a series of short lines written in an unsteady hand. 1. Keep the door locked after dusk, even if you're still inside. 2. Do not open the generator shed at night. 3. If you hear tapping on the window, it's not the wind. Don't look. 4. The creek freezes solid by mid-October. Don't walk over it, even then. Leave one lantern burning till sunrise, always. I stood there reading it over and over, my breath fogging the glass. The first 2 rules made some sense: security, wildlife, standard isolation habits. The others not so much, especially number 3. I told myself it was Henry's eccentricity, maybe a coping thing. When you live alone too long, you invent structure to keep your mind from fraying. Still, there was something off about the tone. These weren't suggestions, they were warnings. By the time I got the stove lit, daylight was fading. The sky turns purple here before it goes black, like the sun's being swallowed slow. I walked the perimeter with my flashlight, checking for damage. The outbuildings were in rough shape. A shed with a padlocked door, likely the generator shed, an outhouse sunk crooked into the ground, and an old snowmobile tarp wrapped under the porch. The place was livable barely. I radioed into the district office before I lost reception, just a quick check-in. Told them I'd be off-grid for a while doing property assessment. They didn't ask questions. In Alaska, you don't. By 8 p.m., the wood stove had the cabin warm enough to peel off my jacket. I sat at the table eating canned chili and looking at that rules list again. I tried to imagine my uncle writing it, the same man who once taught me how to gut a salmon and patch a roof. He'd always been methodical, but never superstitious. The handwriting was shaky, almost like he'd been scared while writing. Outside, the wind started pushing against the cabin walls, low and rhythmic. Pine branches scraped the roof. I reminded myself that in this state, sound carries strangely through snow and wood. Still, when I heard a tap 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 against the window beside the table, my spoon froze halfway to my mouth. I told myself it was just a loose shutter, maybe a branch. But there weren't any trees close enough on that side to reach the window. I waited, 1 breath, 2, then the tapping came again, lighter this time, almost polite. I stood slowly, walked to the window and forced myself to look. Nothing. Just my reflection in the glass, pale face ranger patch catching the lantern glow. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The night hit like a wall. My breath crystallized in front of me. No footprints near the window. Just a single set, mine, leading back from the shed. Something metallic squeaked inside the generator shed then, like a hinge shifting under weight. I went still. The padlock on the shed door gleamed under my flashlight. Closed tight, untouched. Probably the wind, I told myself again, though it had that too deliberate rhythm, like a hand moving something gently side to side. I backed away and went inside, locked the door. I didn't sleep right away. Instead, I dug through the drawers, hoping to find more of my uncle's notes, maybe maintenance logs or maps. In one drawer, I found an old ranger ID, laminated and cracked. Henry looked younger than I remembered, smiling faintly. Behind that, a small notebook. On the inside cover, in the same handwriting as the rules, it read, "I'm gone. Follow them. Don't question." The rest was blank. I left the lantern burning through the night, half out of caution, half superstition. The tapping didn't return, but once around midnight I heard a low hum from the creek, like moving water under glass. It carried just long enough to make me doubt my own hearing. Morning came gray and thin. I stepped outside to find new snow over everything. No animal prints, no signs of visitors. I checked the generator. It was fine, just old. The oil was full. Maybe that's what I'd heard. Metal cooling, wood shifting. Everything had a logical reason if I stretched for it. Still, when I found a second list under a rock on the porch, folded in plastic, my stomach dropped. The handwriting was the same, but the lines were different this time. 1. If the lantern goes out before dawn, leave immediately. 2. Don't call for help. The signal won't hold. Never burn green wood. The smoke draws them. At the bottom, no signature, just an old ranger badge pinned through the paper. My uncle's. I stood there in the cold for a long time, the paper shaking in my hand though the air was still. I wanted to believe it was all a prank, maybe something left for me to find as a test. But Henry hadn't had visitors in years. By noon I'd convinced myself the second list must have been written years ago, maybe during some breakdown or bout of isolation. I'd seen what the winters could do to men up here. The endless dark, the wind whispering like it knew your name. Still, I didn't throw it away. I folded it back up, pinned it beside the first list, and went about splitting firewood. The rhythmic swing of the axe helped clear my head. Each crack echoed into the trees, swallowed quick by snow. Around mid-afternoon, while hauling wood to the porch, I noticed something in the distance near the creek, a figure maybe, standing still, half obscured by fog. My pulse spiked, but when I blinked it was gone, just mist curling off the ice. I told myself fatigue was playing tricks. The drive, the cold, the silence, all of it adds up. My uncle's notes were starting to crawl under my skin. I decided to inventory the cabin before dark. Tools, rations, everything. In the back room I found a second cot, folded up and dusty, and a stack of ranger reports dated 1978-1981. Most were mundane, wildlife sightings, trail maintenance logs. But the last page was strange. It described unusual nocturnal activity near creek perimeter, and acoustic anomalies, repetitive knocking patterns. That was his handwriting. Younger but still recognizable. I sat down on the cot, flipping through the pages until my head spun. My uncle had reported the same noises I'd heard last night. Back then, he was supposed to be miles from here on patrol. Why had he lied about his post? The radio on my belt crackled faintly, static, then silence. I tried to raise the station, but the signal was gone. By dusk, clouds rolled in thick and low. Snow started again, heavy flakes swirling like dust. I shut the shutters, locked the door, and lit both lanterns. This time I didn't bother arguing with myself. I followed the rules. At 7:43 p.m., the first knock came again. Not on the window this time, on the door. 3 short taps, a pause, then 2 more. And then silence. I didn't move. The lantern flame trembled slightly, its light bending on the glass. I checked my watch, every second stretching too long. I told myself it was just the wood settling, but the knocks had rhythm. A human rhythm. I waited a full minute before reaching for the shotgun. My voice came out hoarse when I finally spoke. Who's there? No answer. The only sound was the wind building again, brushing past the corners of the cabin. When I looked toward the window, I saw faint movement, not outside, but reflected behind me, near the back door. I spun around, pulse hammering. Nothing, only the second lantern flickering weakly on the counter. I didn't sleep that night either. I just sat in the chair with the shotgun across my lap, eyes on the door, trying to piece together a logical reason for everything. Maybe some local trespasser testing me, maybe an animal drawn by the light. Anything but what my uncle's lists implied. By the time dawn broke, pale light bleeding through the frosted glass, the knocks had stopped. But outside, in the fresh snow by the porch, were prints. Human ones, barefoot, leading from the creek to the steps, and stopping at the door. The prints by the porch weren't what rattled me most. It was how clean they were. No melt, no drag marks. Just 5 distinct toes pressed into the snow like a mold. And they stopped right at the top step, as if whoever, or whatever, made them had vanished into thin air. I squatted beside them, tracing the edges with my gloved hand. They were small, maybe size 8 bare. The idea of anyone walking barefoot out here was absurd. We were 10 miles from the nearest homestead. The morning temperature was 16 below. Even a short exposure like that would have meant frostbite in minutes. I followed the trail back toward the creek. It ended halfway down the yard, fading where the wind had blown snow overnight. No return prints, no signs of struggle, just silence stretching across the valley. Someone camped nearby, I muttered aloud, needing to hear a voice, even if it was my own. Drifter, maybe got turned around. That was the only reasonable answer. Someone had wandered through late at night, maybe looking for shelter, saw the lantern burning and lost their nerve. I'd dealt with squatters and lost hikers before. They didn't always think straight when cold and hungry. I returned inside, made coffee, and radioed the district office again. Static. Not even a crackle this time. I checked the antenna on the truck. It was intact. Could have been the mountains blocking signal, or the atmospheric inversion that happens after long freezes. I logged it mentally, another thing to fix. After breakfast, I decided to check the perimeter properly. I'd been so wound up last night I hadn't scouted beyond the clearing. Now, with full daylight, I wanted answers. The creek glimmered through thin fog, a ribbon of blue glass under frost. The ice looked thick enough to cross, but my uncle's note came back to me, don't walk over it, even then. I stopped a few feet from the bank. Beneath the surface, faint air pockets pulsed and drifted. Trapped bubbles, nothing more. Still, the sound it made was strange, a low, hollow tone that carried just enough rhythm to trick my ears. Something metallic caught the light near the opposite bank. I raised my binoculars. A tin bucket, half buried in snow. Next to it, a post driven into the ground, with what looked like wire running into the trees. Trapping gear, maybe. That fit Henry's habits. He'd trapped mink for side income in the 80s. I made a note to cross and retrieve it once I could confirm the ice thickness. By midday, clouds rolled in, flattening the light. I spent the next hour splitting more wood and checking the generator shed. The padlock still hung untouched. I knelt beside it, tested the hasp, solid. The sound I'd heard last night might have been thermal shift, metal contracting and cold. Simple physics still. I had a feeling about what might be inside backup fuel, maybe a radio repeater. If the weather held, I'd pry the door open before dusk and inspect. The department wouldn't fault me for inventorying my own property. Inside the cabin, the lists on the wall fluttered slightly from draft. I pinned the edges down with tacks, studied them again. Don't burn green wood. Don't call for help. They read like instructions written by someone half convinced the world had turned against him. My uncle must have been slipping near the end. Paranoid, maybe delusional. Isolation can do that, especially in winter. I found canned goods in the pantry, expiration dates stretching back years. Some were recent enough to keep. Evidence Henry hadn't been gone that long. His coffee tin still sat on the stove shelf, and inside I found a small metal flash drive sealed in a plastic bag. That made me pause. There wasn't any computer in the cabin, but I had my department laptop in the truck. When I plugged it in, a folder appeared instantly. No encryption, just one file labeled June 15 recordings. Inside were 4 short audio clips, each about 20 seconds long. The first one was mostly ambient, wind, maybe water, faintly rhythmic knocks. The second carried the same pattern, louder. The third had Henry's voice, low and strained. Still happening. Same time, same place. Not wind, not trees. Checked the creek, solid ice. Heard something under it. Keeping record, just in case. The fourth clip was just silence. Then, right before it ended, one hard bang, close to the recorder. I sat listening on repeat, heartbeat sensing to that single thud. It could have been anything: frozen timber cracking, sheet ice shifting under pressure. Logical, natural explanations all around me. But hearing his voice like that, calm, certain, alone, unsettled something deeper. Around 1 p.m., I packed a small kit and hiked toward the ridge behind the cabin. Henry's logs mentioned a Northline Trail, once used for surveys. If there were squatters or poachers around, they might be camping along it. The trail was faint under snow, but still visible, boot-width prints hardened by freeze. The silence was total, just the crunch of my steps and the hiss of wind across spruce needles. I walked maybe half a mile before finding an old fire ring buried in snow. Charred wood poked through, half-burned beer can in the ashes. Someone had been here recently. 2, maybe 3 days ago. That made the barefoot prints at the cabin even stranger. Whoever camped here had shoes. Why lose them? I photographed the fire ring, then spotted something else nearby. Half of a sleeping bag caught under a branch. I tugged it free. The tag read H. Warren, my uncle's initials. The lining smelled faintly of smoke and something acrid, like spilled kerosene. My stomach tightened. Henry had camped out here near the end. Maybe he'd been too paranoid to stay inside the cabin. Maybe the noises he'd recorded had gotten into his head. At the edge of the clearing, I found a rusted bear trap rigged open but unset. The wire I'd seen from across the creek ran from this trap to another, disappearing under snow, old, likely disused. The metal teeth were dulled, safety pins rusted through. Still, I could imagine the echo of their snap carrying at night, sharp, metallic, rhythmic. That had to be the tapping. The knocks Henry had heard, the same pattern from the recordings. Wind vibrating the wire, making the traps clack open and shut in gusts. I felt relief so sudden it was almost laughter. When you find logic in fear, it feels like light coming back. By the time I returned to the cabin, clouds had darkened to slate. Snow drifted sideways, fine and dry. I stowed the sleeping bag, poured coffee, and wrote a note in my log. Source of noises likely old trap line. Recommend removal. Simple. Clean, solved. Still, as I sat down, I noticed something new on the table. A folded note I hadn't left there. Same paper. Same handwriting. They don't like being disturbed. I froze, eyes darting to the door locked. Windows latched. I'd been gone maybe 2 hours. No tracks on the porch when I came in. I picked the note up. Hands steady, but barely. It wasn't cold or damp, meaning it had been placed there while the cabin stayed sealed. I searched the room's top to bottom, even the crawl space beneath the floorboards. Nothing. No one. I forced myself back into reason. Maybe the note had been inside another book, dislodged when I'd rummaged through Henry's desk earlier. Easy enough mistake. The handwriting matched the old lists exactly. No fresh ink, same faded lines. Probably another scrap he'd written years ago that got shuffled around. I tacked it to the wall beside the others, though my pulse wouldn't slow. Dusk came quick, snow thick, wind low. The light inside turned amber, warm against the dark glass. I set both lanterns up again, more out of habit than belief. Around 6, while checking the stove, I caught movement outside the window. Just a flicker, like someone passing between the trees. I went for my jacket, stepped out, and scanned the clearing. Nothing but the dim white haze of falling snow. But down near the creek, the fog looked wrong. Dense, localized, pulsing faintly like breath. I walked closer, boots crunching through the crust. The fog thinned near the bank. That bucket I'd seen earlier was gone. In its place, a dark circle stained the snow, faintly greasy like wool. Something about it felt chemical. I knelt, touched the edge, smelled fuel. Diesel, maybe. The generator's fuel. I hurried back toward the shed. The padlock was gone, hanging open on its latch. I pulled the door wide, flashlight sweeping through dust and shadows. Inside was a generator, yes, but also rows of jugs, some full, some empty, a cot against the wall, a thermos, a journal, a rusted rifle leaning in the corner. My uncle had been sleeping out here. The journal's last entry stopped me cold. February 9. Can't stay inside anymore. They watched the windows. Heard the traps again. Thought I saw someone by the creek, but prints don't last. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's just me. The date was less than a year ago. I sat on the cot, the air thick with fumes. Everything smelled of diesel and metal and slow decay. My uncle had been unraveling. Recordings, rules, paranoia fed by isolation. And now me in the same place, seeing the same shapes in fog. When I shut the shed door behind me, the wind lifted briefly, enough to scatter the snow at my feet. For a second, I thought I saw new prints beside mine, but they matched exactly heel to toe, stride for stride my own, blown into mirrors by the wind. I went back inside, locked both doors, and sat by the window till night settled. Every explanation still held traps, weather, loneliness. The lists were nothing more than an aging man's attempt to stay sane in silence. Still, when I reached up to blow out the lantern before bed, I hesitated and left it burning. The wind came back after sunset, louder than before. It pressed against the cabin walls with a sound like steady breathing. Every few minutes, one of the rafters groaned, and the stovepipe rattled faintly in its collar. It was the kind of night where every sound seemed to have a pulse. I made myself busy, refilled the lanterns, stacked wood near the stove, double-checked the locks, anything to keep from sitting still too long. When silence stretches too far out here, it starts to echo inside your head. The power from the generator held steady, though the light bulbs flickered now and then. I told myself the diesel smell clinging to my jacket was what made the air feel heavy. In reality, it was the knowing my uncle had slept in that same shed, had written those rules when his thoughts started to spiral. I was living in the residue of his fear. Around 8, I poured a mug of coffee and sat at the table. Snow hissed against the window like sand. I tried again to raise the station on the radio, still dead air. The longer I stared at the receiver, the more I realized how quiet the world was without another human voice. I started cataloging everything for the official report: condition of cabin, inventory, fuel stock, the kind of bureaucratic list that gives you the illusion of order. That's when I noticed the first odd detail. One of the lanterns on the shelf near the back wall was dimming. Not flickering, not dying slowly, just dulling evenly like someone had turned down a dial. I got up, adjusted the wick, checked the fuel. Nothing wrong. I relit it anyway. The flame brightened but didn't burn steady. It trembled in an invisible draft. I held my palm above it and felt the faintest pull, air moving downward, not up. That shouldn't have been possible. I followed the draft toward the floor and found a thin gap in the boards, almost invisible, running the width of the room. Probably a seam between panels, but I couldn't remember seeing it before. I crouched, shone my flashlight, expecting to see ground. Instead, darkness, hollow space. There was a crawl space under the cabin. I grabbed my toolkit and pried up one of the loose boards. The smell hit first, earth dust, and something faintly metallic. My light caught wooden beams and frost, slick dirt. The crawl space wasn't tall enough to stand in, maybe 3 feet high. And there, near the far end, was a glint of metal. I lay flat, sliding halfway in, shoulders scraping the boards. My fingers brushed against something cold and round. A tin can. I pulled it out. The label was gone, rusted through. Inside was a folded scrap of paper sealed in plastic. The handwriting was the same as all the others. If they knock again, don't answer. It's only the echo. I sat back, breathing slow, paper trembling slightly in my hand. My uncle had hidden these everywhere, it seemed. But why under the floor? Maybe he'd been leaving himself reminders, like breadcrumbs through his paranoia. I put the can on the table and paced the room. Every explanation still made sense, but the feeling under my skin didn't listen to sense. It whispered something simpler: you're alone out here, and he wasn't. At 9:30, the generator hiccuped once and steadied. I went outside to check it before the storm worsened. The snow came in thick sheets, erasing everything beyond a few feet. My flashlight beam caught whirls of white and nothing else. The shed's door creaked open easily. Inside, the generator chugged fine, fuel gauge steady. The jugs I'd counted earlier hadn't moved, but the cot was still warm. I touched the blanket, soft heat, unmistakable. I froze, breath clouding in the flashlight beam. Could have been residual warmth from the generator exhaust lighting near it. Sure, I checked. Yeah, a small pipe funneled air close to the cot. Probably conduction through the floor. Logical. All of it. Still, I said out loud. Just physics. Like I needed the words to seal it. Back inside, I shut the door and brushed snow off my shoulders. The lanterns flickered again, sensed like they shared a heartbeat. Then, from somewhere below the floor, I heard it. A knock. Just one this time. Muffled dull, like someone tapping the underside of the cabin with a piece of wood. I froze mid-step. My brain rushed to line up the rational causes. Ice shift, temperature stress, rodents, expansion pops. But my heartbeat drowned them all out. Then another knock. 2 quick taps. I crouched, pressed my ear to the floorboards. The sound came again from the crawl space. Not rhythmical now or regular, hesitant. Could have been runoff freezing beneath the cabin, causing bubbles to burst. Could have been a branch scraping. Anything. I grabbed the flashlight and pried the board up again. The light cut through dust. Nothing moved. I shone it left, then right. Just frozen soil and joists. But the sound came again, slightly to my left, from under the far corner near the wall. I crawled forward this time, shoulders brushing the beams. The air felt warmer down there, thick with the smell of oil. I pushed the flashlight ahead, sweeping. The beam caught movement, a small shape darting through shadow. My pulse jumped till I realized what it was, a weasel. It froze in the light, eyes bright as beads, then scurried toward a crack near the foundation. The knocking must have been it moving around, brushing pipes or boards. Simple, alive, harmless. I laughed once, sharp and too loud in the cramped dark. Jesus, Henry, I muttered. You built all this fear over a damn weasel. When I climbed out, I left the board open for airflow and sat on the cot, adrenaline fading into a cold kind of relief. The rest of the night should have been easy after that. But the storm made sure it wasn't. Around 11, the wind hit hard enough to shake the windows. Snow hammered the roof like handfuls of gravel. The generator dipped twice, lights flickered, and I grabbed my coat to stabilize the vent intake outside. Halfway through tightening the latch, my flashlight beam slid across something near the tree line. A dark mound under the snow. I walked closer, boots sinking deep. The wind stung my face, tearing sound from the world. It was the bucket I'd seen before, the one missing from the creek. It lay overturned near the base of a spruce, half filled with ice, and beside it a pair of boots, old cracked leather frozen stiff. I picked one up. Inside, bits of insulation, fur, no foot. The size matched the prints from earlier. They weren't fresh. The leather was sun-bleached, the soles almost worn smooth. Decades old, maybe even from my uncle's time. He might have lost them crossing the creek years back, and the thaw carried them down. Still, I couldn't shake the image of those clean footprints leading to my door this morning. I brought the boots inside anyway. Left them near the stove to dry. Though they were long past saving, the smell of thawing leather filled the air. I went through the rest of Henry's journal pages in the shed, hoping for context. Near the end of one entry, I found a line that stuck under my ribs. The prints match mine. Every time I closed the notebook, my reflection in the window looked pale, drawn. The storm's noise seemed to press through the walls, flattening everything. Around midnight, I tried to sleep on the cot with the shotgun within reach. I kept the lantern burning, same as before. Every few minutes, wind shifted the shadows across the floorboards like water rippling. Then came another sound. Not a knock this time, something softer. A dragging scrape circling the exterior wall. The sound of snow shifting under slow, deliberate steps. I stood hard hammering. The sound paused near the door, then continued along the porch. Logic said wind could do that. Ice collapse. Shifting drifts. But it didn't sound random. It followed a pattern. Footsteps, then pause. Footsteps again. I killed the lantern, crouched by the window, and peeked through the crack in the curtain. Whiteout. No shapes. Just movement of snow and shadow. Then, faintly through the noise, came that same hollow hum from the creek, low, resonant, like trapped water vibrating under ice. It wasn't mystical. I knew the physics, air pockets compressing, releasing, but hearing it layered with the scraping sound made my chest tighten anyway. I waited until both noises faded into the storm. Then I relit the lantern, sat back on the cot, and forced myself to breathe steady. Every explanation still held, all of it. The prints, the notes, the sounds, each had a reason. The only thing unaccounted for was sleep, and I hadn't had much of that since arriving. Around 3 a.m., I must have drifted off in the chair. I woke to silence, real silence, the kind that feels thick, like the world's holding its breath. Outside, the storm had stopped. The lantern's flame was low, barely clinging to life. I got up to refill it, and that's when I noticed the door. It was unlocked. The bolt was turned clean open. I froze, every hair standing on end. I'd locked it. I knew I had. Twice. I checked the porch, no snow blown in, no fresh prints. The lock itself wasn't damaged, just undone. Fatigue plays tricks, I told myself. Maybe I'd imagined locking it. Maybe I hadn't thrown the bolt hard enough. But as I pushed it closed again, something shifted on the floor. One of the boots. It had fallen on its side, leaving a faint wet outline on the wood. In the outline, the shape looked wrong, narrower, longer than the boot's actual sole, almost like a bare foot. I wiped it away, set the boot upright, and sat back down. The rational part of me was still in charge. Everything could be explained. Sleep deprivation, suggestion, old stories burrowed deep. But the instinctive part, the part that listens to silence and dark, whispered the same thought. My uncle must have had some rules aren't meant to be broken, even when they make no sense. I left the lantern burning till sunrise. The light came thin and blue through the frost-filmed window. For a few seconds I didn't move, just listened. No wind, no generator hum, no creak of settling wood. The silence was total again, the kind that feels staged. My watch read 6:11 a.m. My breath hung in the air. The fire had gone out sometime before dawn. I rose, bones stiff, every muscle wired from a night of half sleep. The lantern still burned weakly, flame barely above the wick. The same lantern that, by all logic, should have run dry hours ago. I turned the valve, snuffed it, and started the stove. The match hissed too loud in the quiet. When heat began to spread, the room looked ordinary again. 4 walls, a stove, stacked wood, not a haunted thing in sight. I repeated that to myself while boiling coffee. Then I saw the door. The lock I'd turned last night, twice, wasn't just open. The latch had been twisted out of alignment, metal bent slightly inward. Not broken, not forced, just moved. I squatted, inspected the hinge screws. One hung loose, thread stripped, maybe from years of use. I tightened it, but something about the angle didn't sit right. It was as if the door had been opened from inside, not out. Fatigue, I muttered. Just fatigue. Coffee helped, at least until I looked toward the stove and noticed the boots. One of them was missing. My stomach dropped. I hadn't moved them since setting them by the fire. I searched under the cot, behind the stove, nothing. It made no sense to fixate on that, but I did. You cling to patterns when the rest slips. I layered up, took the flashlight, and stepped outside. The world was white and blank. Fresh snow covered everything, soft as wool. No wind, no tracks. The creek murmured faintly beneath a glass crust, a sound so steady it almost passed for breathing. The missing boot sat on the porch rail, upright, balanced perfectly. I stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up. The leather was frozen again, stiff. How it had gotten there? Maybe I'd knocked it myself last night. Maybe it slid somehow. It didn't matter. But it did enough damage to my nerves that my hand shook while brushing snow off. I threw the boots into the shed, locked the door, and left them there. After that, I needed work, something tangible, so I hauled wood, fixed the loose shutter, checked the creek bank for damage. The rational rhythm of maintenance. By mid-morning, I'd almost convinced myself the worst was exhaustion and the cabin's age conspiring to play tricks. Then I found the wire. A thin strand, half buried in snow, running from under the porch out toward the trees. I followed it 30 feet before it disappeared into a drift. Pulled. It gave easily, snapped clean. The end was attached to an old brass bell. the kind you'd hang over a doorway. My uncle's trap line. I dug along the wire's path until I reached a second bell near the creek, tarnished and silent. Another near a pine trunk farther uphill. A perimeter, rough circle around the cabin. The knocking, the echo, the tapping on windows. He hadn't been hearing ghosts. He'd rigged warning bells, and the wind had turned them into his private haunting. I stood there with the bell in my palm, metal cold as bone, and for the first time since arriving, I laughed without bitterness. The sound startled a raven from the ridge. It croaked once and vanished into light. The relief was dizzying. Everything fit again. I followed the last of the line toward the creek to make sure it ended where I thought it did. Halfway down, I slipped on a patch of ice, skidded to one knee, and my glove hit something buried. Metal again. Digging with my hands, I uncovered a small lockbox, half rusted through. The lid wasn't latched. Inside were envelopes, 3 of them, waterproofed with wax paper, all addressed in that same tired scrawl, "To whoever finds this first." June 15 recordings. Backup. If I'm not me. I took them back to the cabin, wiped the table, and sat at the table. My pulse was high again, but not from fear this time. Curiosity, maybe dread's cousin. The first envelope held a letter dated 4 months before Henry's death. I hear it even in daylight now. The knocks have rhythm like words. I tried moving the traps farther, but it followed the house. Maybe pressure shifts. Maybe something under the frost line. I can't tell anymore. Sleep is thin. I forget to eat. If you find this, don't stay too long. Solitude is a kind of noise. He'd underlined that last line twice. The second envelope contained a small SD card, same labeling as the flash drive. I plugged it into the laptop. More audio, 10 clips this time, longer. The first few were wind and bells. Then, gradually, Henry's voice again, testing resonance. Bell 4 triggered at 0300. Wind steady south-southwest. No animals. Confirmed vibration pattern matches last week. Could be seismic. Could be frost hiv. Heard the creek hum again. Not water. Air through ground cavities. Maybe old burrow tunnels. Feels alive when it moves. By the 8th recording, his voice was thinner. Almost apologetic. It's just the land talking. Always was. I just forgot how to listen without naming things. Then silence. No final entry, no explanation for why he'd left the cabin. Only coordinates scribbled in one of the metadata notes. North Ridge elevation marker 640, roughly a mile uphill. I should have let it rest there, but curiosity has its own gravity. By noon, the sky had cleared enough for a short hike. I marked the cabin on GPS and started up the ridge. The snow had crusted overnight, crunching under boots. The cold bit sharp enough to taste metal. Halfway up, I found the marker. A small cairn of stones, a rusted pole sticking out. A patch of disturbed snow nearby drew my eye. Beneath it, the ground had sunken slightly, forming a shallow depression. I kicked snow aside and uncovered a metal pipe no wider than my wrist, sticking straight up from the ground. It was capped, sealed with what looked like welding. Next to it, faint tracks led back downhill. Old, probably Henry's. A ventilation pipe. I crouched and pressed my ear to it. Faint hum, same low tone I'd heard near the creek. Air moving under pressure. Maybe from a subsurface spring or a buried drainage line. The voices, the tapping. Every bit of it had a physical cause. My uncle had spent his last years chasing patterns until he forgot which ones were real. The relief hit hard enough that I laughed again, a dry bark lost to wind. I stayed there longer than I meant to, watching light play over the ridge until a small tremor underfoot made me step back. Snow collapsed slightly around the pipe, sending a soft woof through the air. The hum died, pressure equalization. Natural. Still, it sent a ripple of unease up my spine. I hiked back fast, adrenaline running thin. When the cabin came into view, smoke rising from the chimney loop, promise of normal life again. Inside, everything sat exactly as I'd left it, except the rule lists. Both sheets on the wall had curled away from the tacks, hanging loose like something had tugged at them. I smoothed them flat. One nail slipped free, dropped to the floor, rolled toward the open floorboard gap. I bent to pick it up and froze. In the crack between boards I saw movement. Not an animal, this time light. A slow, steady pulse of orange, like embers deep in the crawlspace. I pried the board open, expecting a reflection from the stove's glow, but the angle was wrong. The flicker came from under the shed end of the cabin. I crawled halfway in, flashlight ready, and saw it a small metal pan, the kind you'd use for catching oil. Inside, a candle burned low, flame steady despite the lack of draft. Melted wax ran into the dirt. Beside it sat an old photograph, my uncle standing outside this same cabin, younger, smiling faintly. I backed out slowly, heart beating in my throat. Someone, maybe Henry himself, had placed that candle there. Maybe a ritual of some kind, maybe habit. I carried the pan out, snuffed the flame, and set it by the stove. No ghosts, no mystery. Just one man's way of keeping light alive in the dark. But the fact it was still burning after all this time unsettled me. Maybe the wax had reignited from residual heat when I ran the stove. Or maybe I'd missed it earlier. Either way, it didn't belong under the floor. As afternoon stretched thin, I packed my things. My plan was to drive back to base camp before dusk. I'd leave a note for the inheritance office, log the cabin as unfit for habitation. Let someone else sort through the echoes. But when I stepped outside, the weather had changed again. Sky clouding fast, temperature dropping like a trapdoor. The truck's ignition stuttered twice and died, battery drained. I slammed the door, stared out over the ridge. The light was going fast. No signal, no backup generator ready to move. Another night here, whether I wanted it or not. Back inside, I fed the stove and sat by the table, going through every logical checklist I knew. Nothing supernatural, just coincidence stacked high enough to mimic something else. Still, the silence pressed. I found myself whispering to the empty room. "You're real, Eli. The rest is noise." Somewhere beneath the floor, wood popped from heat. It sounded almost like a knock. By dusk, I'd run out of explanations that comforted me. The science still held. Pressure changes, old wiring, wildlife. But each answer felt thinner, stretched over something I didn't want to name. Logic was beginning to sound like a bedtime story told to keep from hearing the dark. The temperature dropped fast. The stove crackled weakly, fire fighting wet wood. I sat on the cot watching frost crawl over the window pane. The storm had paused, but a stillness worse than wind had taken its place. The kind that makes you notice your own pulse. The truck battery was gone, and the radio couldn't even pull static anymore. I had one more day's worth of fuel, a dozen hours of daylight tomorrow to hike out if the weather held. I told myself that was the plan. Then I heard the first sound. It came from the ridge, the deep, hollow boom of shifting snow. A small slide, probably. The kind that happens when new powder settles on old ice. The second sound came closer, a faint metallic ring, followed by another, like small bells moving in the wind. My uncle's bells, the ones I'd taken down that morning. I froze, listening. The air was perfectly still. Bells can't ring without motion. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. Cold bit through my jacket immediately, sharp enough to sting. The world was gray, blue, half light, half snow. Nothing moved except a thin curl of smoke from the stovepipe. Then, there it was again. A faint chime to my right, near the creek. I followed it, boots crunching. Every sound I made seemed to bounce back doubled. When I reached the bank, the creek had frozen solid overnight. The sound came from underneath. A hollow ringing through ice, echoing from below. Relief hit, but not for long. Because when I crouched to listen, I saw something embedded in the ice, a glint of brass. One of the bells, not strung to wire. Just sitting there, frozen halfway down. Henry must have lost it years ago, the current carrying it under before the freeze. The ice expanding against metal created the sound when temperature shifted. Physics again, the one steady god in this country. I turned back toward the cabin. From this angle, I could see its outline against the dim sky, small, square, human. But in the snow between me and it, another shape moved. Quick, low, gone, probably an animal. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and took the long route back around the shed, scanning the tree line. Fresh snow gave nothing away. No tracks, no holes. Just smooth drifts inside again. The warmth hit me hard. I set the rifle by the door, rechecked the locks, and sat with my back to the wall. The rules were still pinned above the table, curling slightly from heat. I read them again, each line like a riddle whose answer was sanity. Keep the door locked after dusk. Do not open the generator shed at night. If you hear tapping on the window, it's not the wind. I'd broken every one of them. Around 9, I caught myself nodding off in the chair. My body wanted sleep, my mind didn't trust what would happen in it. Every time my eyes shut, the cabin seemed to tilt, space narrowing, light bending. The human brain can conjure company out of loneliness. I'd seen it happen to other rangers. It was happening to me now. I forced myself up, checked the stove again. Fire steady, lanterns trimmed, nothing out of order. Then I saw the flashlight beam still faintly glowing on the table. I was sure I'd turned it off. Battery near dead, but light still pulsing weakly. I clicked it off for real and set it down. The pulse continued. Then I realized it wasn't the flashlight. It was coming from below, a dull, rhythmic glow leaking through the cracks in the floorboards. I dropped to my knees, pried one board loose. The light flared, orange and trembling the candle. The same one I'd pulled out earlier, except it wasn't in the pan now. It was lit again, directly under the center of the cabin. My stomach clenched. I crawled halfway under, heat brushing my face. The candle burned cleanly on bare earth, wax pooled around it. No pan, no match, no spark except the impossible one that must have relit it. I told myself the truth had to be dull. Maybe I'd missed another candle. Maybe I'd left it half burning. Maybe the draft reignited it somehow. I snuffed it out with my glove, crawled back out, and sat on the floor breathing like I'd run a mile. When I finally stood, my knee hit something hard under the cot. I pulled it out, a metal tin, same kind I'd found earlier. Inside was another scrap of paper. Don't let the light go out. It listens in the dark. My uncle's handwriting again. I sat there a long while with that note in my hand, coffee gone cold, trying to picture him writing it. Was he sitting in the same spot, hearing the same sounds, convincing himself the same rules were truth? A low creak answered me from the porch. Not wind, wood bending under weight. I raised the rifle, stepped toward the door, heart knocking faster than whatever was outside. Another creak. Then silence. I counted to 10, then unlatched the door and threw it open. Nothing but snow. The beam from my flashlight caught a faint trail of indentations leading away from the steps. Too small and uneven for boots, too round for hooves. I leaned closer. Droplets, frozen drips of water spaced apart like footprints melting and refreezing in rhythm. Condensation falling from the roofline, that's all I exhaled, long and shaky. Henry, I said to no one, you really did lose it. The laugh that followed came out thin. Inside again, I barricaded the door with the chair. Not because I believed in whatever he'd feared, but because the thought of the door swinging open on its own one more time was enough to unspool me. Midnight came slow. The cabin's temperature fell despite the fire. My watch ticked loud enough to sound like footsteps. I wrote in my notebook, dates, times, everything that had happened. A report for when I made it back. The act of writing turned chaos into record, record into control. Halfway through a sentence, the pen slipped from my hand. Because there it was again, that same hum, not from the creek this time, from below. Deep, vibrating through the floorboards like the earth exhaling. I pressed my palm down and felt the vibration steady, rhythmic, alive. It was the air vent, I realized. The pipe I'd found on the ridge connected here somehow underground. Cold air expanding, moving through frozen soil, a natural bellows. But the sound carried cadence. 4 beats. 4 beats. I whispered the word echo without meaning to. The candlelight flashed again, faintly from the crack. That was when I stopped trying to explain everything and just acted. I grabbed the stove poker, pried the loose boards wider, and stomped the flame out with one blow. Smoke curled up, acrid, choking. I said aloud, and maybe to myself too. I dragged the pan, the candle, every hidden note and bell I'd found, out into the snow, piled them in front of the cabin, and poured what was left of the diesel over the heap. My hands shook while I struck the match. The flame caught instantly, orange light flaring against the white world. When it was done, I kicked snow over the ashes until the last glow vanished. No echoes. Just cold inside. The cabin felt heavier but cleaner. The rules on the wall hung limp, colorless. I unpinned them, folded them flat, and slid them into my pack. They were evidence now, not gospel. It was nearly 2 a.m. When I finally sat again, I told myself the next sunrise would mean something. It would mean the start of leaving. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, constant, erasing every trace of what I'd burned. I closed my eyes for a minute. When I opened them, the lantern was dimming. Out of habit, I reached to turn it up. Then I stopped. Maybe it was better to let the light die and prove the world stayed still. So I sat there in the dark, listening, waiting. The hum didn't return. No tapping, no creak. Only the faint crackle of cooling metal, the sound of heat escaping into cold. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, pale light was sliding through the window again. Morning. I was still alive. The cabin was quiet. The rules were gone. I mean, physically gone. The folded pages I'd packed were no longer on the table. The pack sat open, untouched otherwise. I checked the porch. The wind had scattered the snow, smoothed the world clean again. For the first time since I arrived, I felt nothing watching. Just air, frost, and the faint trace of wood smoke. Henry had left his fear here, and I'd walked through it long enough to see its shape. It was just isolation, the echo that grows a face if you listen long enough. I cleaned the cabin top to bottom, sealed the crawl space, and doused the stove. By noon, I'd packed the truck, jump-started the engine with the emergency kit, and turned down the trail toward the highway. When I looked back, the cabin was shrinking into the trees, window catching sunlight like an open eye closing. The hum under the snow was gone, or maybe I'd just stopped hearing it. The drive out should have been simple. 2 hours of forest road, then a long stretch of gravel that wound south toward the main highway and the ranger substation. But nothing in Alaska ever stays simple. Not the roads, not the weather, and certainly not the human mind after a few days alone in the quiet. By the time I reached the first turnoff, fog was rolling back down the ridge. It came in thin at first, then thick enough to erase the tree line entirely. The truck's headlights pushed no farther than a few yards ahead, illuminating snow that looked the same in every direction. The GPS flickered between coordinates, struggling for signal. I'd logged this drive 100 times before on patrol, but every bend looked wrong now. The snow, the light, the silence, it all conspired to flatten distance. I slowed to 10 miles an hour, following my own tire tracks from the day I'd arrived. They looked faint, half swallowed by new snow. After 15 minutes, I realized the compass was spinning lazy circles. Probably the iron deposits in the ridge. Still, that old, stupid thought came creeping back. What if the land doesn't want me to leave? I gripped the wheel harder and said out loud, "There's no wanting in land. There's just weather." Hearing my own voice helped. So did the rumble of the tires. About 10 miles in, I saw the shape of another vehicle through the fog, dark green, parked halfway off the road. My first jolt was relief people, maybe the forestry crew or another ranger doing boundary checks. When I pulled closer, I recognized it. It was the same model of department truck. Same markings, same dent on the rear fender. Mine. For half a second, I thought the fog was tricking me, making the distance fold on itself. Then I saw the plate numbers. My plate numbers. I killed the engine, got out, and walked a slow circle around the truck. Same scratches on the door, same chains on the tires, same supply box in the back. Except this one was covered in a thin layer of frost like it had been sitting there for days. I looked back down the road. My own tracks disappeared into fog behind me, but I couldn't hear my engine anymore either. No sound, no light. The silence closed in again. I checked the odometer on the frozen truck. Same mileage as mine down to the digit. The key was still in the ignition, turned halfway. When I touched the door handle, my reflection looked pale and warped in the window glass. Eyes hollow from lack of sleep, jaw clenched too tight. It took me a moment to notice that the keychain hanging from the ignition wasn't the same. It wasn't my department tag. It was my uncle's. The old Ranger brass fob he'd carried back in the 70s, stamped with the DNR crest. I stepped back fast enough to slip on the ice. Heart thudding. No, it couldn't be his. Couldn't be anything but a copy. People reuse tags, swap gear. Still, my brain reached for the math his truck would have been decommissioned decades ago. This model didn't exist then. The mind's first trick in isolation is pattern recognition. The second is attachment to it. I turned away, forcing air into my lungs. The fog began to lift in streaks, thin enough now to see the slope ahead. My own truck, the real one, waited there, idling where I'd left it. For a moment I thought I saw movement in the passenger seat, a shift of shadow, but it was only the mirror-catching light. I walked back, climbed in, slammed the door, and sat breathing until my hands steadied. The other truck was gone when I looked again. Just road and fog, and the faint shape of trees returning to view. I didn't check twice. I drove. The rest of the route blurred. By noon, the sky lightened enough to see the range ahead and, eventually, the green metal roof of the substation. I parked crooked, stumbled out, and let the smell of coffee and heating oil wrap around me like something holy. Ranger Wallace, the senior on duty, looked up from his desk with raised eyebrows. "You look like hell, Warren." "Yeah," I said, voice raw. "The cabin's worse." He poured coffee without asking, slid the mug over. I told him everything, most of it anyway. The lists, the noises, the bells, the recordings, the traps. I left out the part about the second truck. That one still felt like something the mind makes when it's short on sleep. He listened without interruption. That's a skill rangers learn early. Let silence do the work. When I finished, he scratched his beard and said, "You know your uncle's file's still in archives here. He logged the property under private homestead, but he sent in reports for years after he left the service. You want to see them?" I did. He unlocked the old cabinet, the kind with stiff drawers and faded labels. The folder read Warren Henry, 1978-1989. Inside reports, photographs, maps. The handwriting was the same. The tone was the same. At first, they were mundane: wildlife density, trail conditions, poacher deterrence. Then, around 1982, the language shifted. Possible subsurface vibration pattern continues. Origin unknown. Bells deployed to track nocturnal disturbances. Recommend seismic study of ridge. Possible sinkhole formation. Wallace flipped a few pages. "Yeah, I remember this stuff. They thought he was hearing permafrost movement. Pockets collapsing underground. Common enough up here. Makes all kinds of noise in winter." He pointed to one report with a coffee-stained corner. They sent a survey team in '84. Found small venting channels under that creek. Natural air resonance. That's your hum. I read the line 3 times, the relief hitting slow. Henry hadn't been haunted, just attentive. Too attentive. He'd listened until normal geology sounded like conversation. "What about after '89? I asked. Wallace frowned. He stopped filing. Guess he went fully off-grid. We figured he'd retired. He closed the drawer and looked at me. "You staying up there long?" "No," I said. "Not after this." He nodded, like he'd expected that answer. Place gets under your skin. Happens to good men. Write your report, get some sleep. You'll feel right after daylight. I spent the afternoon at the back desk typing up the incident record. I wrote it dry and factual. Cabin discovered in poor repair. Structural soundness compromised. Psychological deterioration of previous occupant likely result of isolation compounded by environmental resonance. It read clean. Rational. By the time I hit print, the sun had dropped behind the peaks. Wallace had gone home. The office felt too big in his absence, so I sat there longer than I needed, letting the hum of the heater fill the gaps. On impulse, I played one of Henry's recordings again from my laptop. The last one, the single hard knock before it cuts out. It didn't sound like a knock this time. It sounded like something falling. I checked the file properties. The timestamp wasn't from June 15, the label on the folder. It was from February 9. The same date as his final journal entry. The day he'd written "Maybe It's Me." Something about that hit sideways. He hadn't died in the cabin, that much the coroner's report confirmed later. They'd found him near the creek, hypothermic, half a mile downstream. Maybe he'd gone out chasing the hum one more time. Maybe he'd fallen through weak ice. I stared at the screen until the cursor blurred. Then I copied the recordings onto a new drive, slid it into the department archive box with the rest. When I finally left the substation, night had taken the valley again. Clear skies, stars sharp enough to hurt. The drive to the motel took 20 minutes. I checked in, showered, sat on the bed with the light on. I meant to sleep, but habit made me glance once at the door. Old reflex, I locked it. Not because I feared what was outside, but because some rules stick whether or not they make sense. As I lay there, I thought of Henry's line, solitude is a kind of noise. He wasn't wrong. Out there, silence doesn't stay empty. It fills with whatever you bring into it. Memory, fear, echo. I'd gone looking for what haunted him and found only proof of how the mind bends when it's left with itself too long. At 30:17 a.m., I woke without knowing why. The room was quiet except for the radiator ticking. I turned on the bedside light. On the nightstand, next to my keys and the half-empty coffee cup, lay something I hadn't put there. A small brass bell, tarnished, the same kind my uncle used. For a second, I didn't move. Then I smiled, small, tired. Wallace must have dropped it in my bag earlier, a joke, or maybe a souvenir from the cabin. I turned it over in my hand. It didn't ring. The clapper inside was gone. Just metal, just silence. I set it down and went back to sleep. 3 days after leaving the cabin, I filed the report. It sat now in the archive server under a line of bland metadata. There was a strange comfort in that word. Closed, like a lid sealing over something that shouldn't breathe anymore. The district office smelled like dust and burnt coffee. Same as always. Paperwork stacked on one side of the desk, radio chatter on the other. If not for the ache behind my eyes, I could have believed I'd never left. I spent the morning sorting through maps, updating snowpack readings, answering routine calls. Normal things. Small noises to drown out the quiet that had followed me back. Every now and then, the silence between transmissions would stretch too long, and my mind would drift to the sound of the creek under ice. The low hum that wasn't music, wasn't voice, but something steady enough to trick you into listening. I still half expected to hear it under the heater's drone. At noon, Ranger Wallace came by with lunch. He didn't ask about the cabin, just dropped a sandwich on my desk and said, "You're in the rotation for base patrol next week. Want me to keep you local?"
Yeah,
I said. "Stick me near the river crossings for a bit?"
thought so.
He took a bite, talked around the bread. "You burn those notes." "I turned them in," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "That's one way of burning them." We didn't talk more. That was the nice thing about working with people who understood silence. It didn't need to be patched up with words. When he left, I opened the top drawer of my desk. The brass bell sat there. Same dull gleam, same missing clapper. I'd meant to give it back to him, but I'd kept it without thinking. It wasn't haunting, exactly. Just a reminder that sometimes mystery ends smaller than you expect. I rolled it between my fingers. The metal was cold. That night, back at the motel, I played the last of my uncle's recordings one more time. The knock at the end still made my chest tighten, though I knew what it was now. I'd shown it to the office tech. He said it was consistent with seismic microfractures under frozen terrain. The valley's ground literally cracking from cold. Sound carried through the frozen creek like a drum. Henry had been hearing the earth freeze itself apart. I should have felt closure, but I didn't. The rational answer never feels as satisfying as the story you built around it. Still, I accepted it. That's what we do. We take the strange and flatten it into fact so we can keep walking into the woods. 2 days later, I drove back north to Fairbanks for the property handover. The lawyer's office was small, windows fogged, the kind of place that smells faintly of paper and heating oil. She slid the final deed across the desk. "The cabin's yours now, Mr. Warren. You can sell it, donate it, or keep it." I stared at the paper longer than I meant to. "You know anyone who'd want it?" She laughed politely. Not many takers for isolation these days. I signed anyway, not because I wanted it, but because leaving it ownerless felt worse. The land didn't deserve to sit abandoned with that much memory clinging to it. The drive back south was clear. Sunlight off the snowfields turned everything into glare. I stopped once, halfway down the ridge, to stretch my legs. From there, I could see the distant line of the range, the valley where the cabin sat hidden between folds of white. You'd never know it was there. Just another dot on the map, another echo swallowed by miles of silence. I thought about Henry then, not as the frightened man who wrote those rules, but as a ranger, someone who'd once walked these same roads believing in order and explanation. He hadn't lost that belief, he just drowned in its excess. When everything becomes pattern, you start seeing meaning where there's only weather. I got back in the truck and drove until radio signal returned. The rest of the week was routine. Patrol logs, calls about snowmobile trespassers. One search and rescue drill. Nothing that asked for thought beyond the immediate. My hands remembered work and that helped. But nights were different. I'd wake at odd hours. Sure, I'd heard something faint. The hum, the knock, the tap. Each time it turned out to be the heater, the pipes, the wind against siding. I wrote them down anyway, same as Henry had done. Not because I believed in them, but because the act of writing kept them small. By the weekend, I drove back to my apartment on the edge of town. I unpacked, made coffee, turned the TV on low just for company. The bell sat on the counter beside my keys. I caught myself glancing at it like it might move. It never did. That night, I dreamed of the cabin not as it was, but as it might have been decades ago. Fresh wood, smoke rising, my uncle younger, standing in the doorway with that tired smile. He wasn't warning me this time. He just looked relieved, like someone had finally heard him, even if too late. When I woke, dawn light spilled across the counter. The bell gleamed dull gold in it. I took it with me on patrol later, tucked in my jacket pocket. Some habits are hard to kill. At the far edge of the district, there's a ranger memorial, names of those who died in service carved into granite. I hadn't been there since my first year. Henry's name wasn't on it, of course. He'd left before the service could claim him. Still, I stood there a while reading the names. Snow fell quiet and light, soft enough to sound like static when it landed. I reached into my pocket, took out the bell, and set it on the stone. The wind caught it once, enough to make a faint clink even without the clapper. Then it stilled. That was enough sound. Back at the office, Wallace asked if I'd decided what to do with the cabin. "Yeah," I said. "I'll keep it under department maintenance. Maybe rebuild the bridge, clean up the area, turn it into a research outpost or a rest stop." He grinned. "Guess the ghosts don't scare you off easy." "There were never any ghosts," I said. "Just echoes." He nodded. "Same thing, sometimes. We let that hang." He went back to his desk. I opened the window blinds. Sunlight poured across the floor, bright and ordinary. That afternoon I typed one last entry into the official report before archiving it. Findings confirm environmental cause for auditory phenomena. Area remains structurally sound. Recommend cabin remain under limited ranger jurisdiction for historical and research value. Personal note: isolation amplifies noise. The mind supplies pattern. The real danger isn't what's outside, it's what repeats inside when you stop talking long enough to hear it. I added my signature, date, coordinates, and shut the file. Later that night, I drove to the edge of town where the forest starts again. The sky was clear, stars sharp enough to look brittle. I rolled down the window and listened. No hum, no knocking, just the normal rhythm of wind moving through trees. Still, I caught myself glancing at the dashboard clock right as it clicked over to midnight. Habit. Checking for the pattern. Nothing happened. I laughed quietly, shook my head, and drove home. The bell now sits on the shelf above my desk, beside the ranger badge my uncle left behind. Sometimes, on cold nights when the pipes settle or the walls creak, I think about those rules he wrote and how I followed most of them, even after learning what they were for. Not because I believe in them, because sometimes superstition is just a story that helps you remember the right kind of caution. If I ever go back to that valley, I'll leave a new list on the cabin wall. Not warnings, not rules, just one line: lock the door after dusk. Not because something's coming, just because that's when the silence starts to sound like company.